don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offerings brought to the temple, and those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. Yet I have never used any of these rights, and I am not writing this to suggest that I want to start now. In fact, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. Yet preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. I am compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I didn't preach the good news. If I were doing this on my own initiative, I would deserve payment, but I have no choice, for God has given me his sacred trust. What then is my pay? It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights when I preach the good news.
Even though I am a free man with no master, I become a slave to all the people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. When I was with those who follow the Jewish law, I lived too under that law. Even though I am not subject to the law, I did this so I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I am with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from that law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. I obey the law of Christ. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some.
I want to start actually with an illustration that relates to music. One of the cultural developments of the Industrial Revolution was the development of brass bands, particularly in England. There were technological advances that produced better instruments. There was mass production that produced more instruments. There was better transportation that got ways to distribute those instruments to various places, to a growing working class population in the Industrial Revolution. So that happened in sort of the mid to late 1800s. And what happened was that most towns actually had a brass band. And it became very, very popular. They were divided into divisions and leagues, and they had competitions and finals, and almost like a sports league kind of a thing. It got to be so big in that way. By the early 1900s, there were well over 20,000 brass bands in England, with, they say, over what was it? Yeah, 20,000. They don't say how many, but even today there are still 4,000 brass bands and about 80,000 musicians that are playing in brass bands in England. So while the brass bands were growing in popularity in the mid to late 1800s, something else interesting happened. There was an itinerant evangelist by the name of William Booth, and he sort of adopted brass bands as a tool to attract people to their evangelistic meetings. And people were attracted to the music, and they ended up placing their faith in Jesus. Now, the Salvation Army took some criticism for using that secular music of the day, and William Booth is quoted as saying, well, you must sing good tunes. Let it be a good tune to begin with. I don't care much whether you call it secular or sacred, and I rather enjoy robbing the devil of his choicest tunes. Isn't that good? He understood that music was close to the heart of people. And if you use music that people enjoyed, it may open the door of their heart to spiritual truth. Now, there's a very obvious evangelistic principle that the church sometimes can stray from. And that's if you want people to listen to what you have to say, you have to speak to them in a language they understand. If you want people to listen to what you have to say, you have to speak to them in a language they understand. But language is more than just words. Language is also culture. So as Trish mentioned, we're continuing today in a section in 1 Corinthians. Actually, there's one more in this section on culture next week. And Paul talks about how we interact with culture. Last week, it was that issue about eating food that was sacrificed to idols. And Paul gave this conclusion: you're free to eat, but you're also responsible for your relational wake. Our cultural decisions are not to be just about what we know, but how we best love those who are around us. Paul applies that truth in another way in the section that we read earlier in 1 Corinthians 9. Now, if you just joined online and you joined at this point and didn't get a chance to read that, you can pause and you can read the whole section, actually read all of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. We're going to be referring to all of it. And when you read it, or when we were reading that, at first glance, it might seem like this is a little bit odd. Is this a little bit of a goat trail that he's going on as he talks about preachers getting paid? What is he talking about? What does that have to do with what he's talking about? It actually connects with the previous passage about a discussion about cultural matters. And in this matter, it connects actually to Paul, it connects to the Corinthian church. Now, we read from verse 13 to 22 earlier in the service, but it actually starts with 4 questions at the beginning of the relationship, beginning of the passage where Paul talks about the relationship between him and the church. And he says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you. For you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. So Paul talks about his relationship with that church, and it might be that he was facing some criticism. Some perhaps were thinking that because Paul and Barnabas didn't draw a salary for their ministry, that it was somehow less legitimate than other teachers who did. Remember, the audience reading this, many of them were the converts. Many of them came to faith in Jesus under the ministry of Paul. God used Paul in a very unique way to plant churches in many places, and he traveled from place to place, and time and again he was able to nurture a relationship that was strong enough, had enough trust in it that people would actually listen to him. And eventually some responded to the preaching of the gospel. They placed their faith in Jesus. What we miss is that Paul was actually operating in a way that was kind of odd for that culture. And there were voices in the church that perhaps suggested that maybe his methods were a little bit extreme. Maybe he should be a little bit more conventional in his methods. So we see when it's talking about Paul's ministry, Paul just goes into this section. It's a fairly long explanation, so I'm not going to go through every verse in it. But really what he is saying that according to the cultural standard at the time, those who preach and teach should receive financial support from those who benefit from it. That's the whole argument in verses 7 through 12. And he uses the illustration earlier in that passage of soldiers should get paid for their work. And if you have an oxen that you're using to tread out the grain, you shouldn't put a muzzle on it. The oxen should be able to eat of the grain that they are working on. Now, if you remember back last fall, we were talking about earlier in the book of Corinthians, where there were some divisions in the church. And some people were saying, I follow Apollos, and other people saying, I follow Peter, and there were other teachers within the church. And there may have been a debate within that church about, well, which leader should be the official leader? Which leader should get paid? Should one of them get paid? Because after all, Paul didn't get paid. So Paul might have been leaning into that question a little bit. But he's saying it's absolutely proper and appropriate for those who teach, for those who are full-time in that ministry of faith, to be able to draw a salary from it. But he also says he chose not to take a salary from the churches that he was planting, that he was serving in that way. It's interesting, though, other churches that he had planted previously or had been involved in, places like Antioch and places like Philippi, they supported his ministry as he was ministering elsewhere. But Paul chose to be mainly self-supporting. And that took the awkward financial dynamic out of his evangelism efforts. The Corinthian believers, they came to faith because of the unique opportunity that arose because of Paul's very countercultural choice. He would place relationships above the cultural customs and religious rules. So that was the situation then. And even now, there's sort of those 3 systems still in place. In many churches, in most churches, at least one person is paid, or sometimes there's several people on staff who are paid. And as well, in churches, we also have the idea where we will pay people who don't work here, but they work elsewhere. In the Christian Missionary Alliance, we put money into a global advance fund, and that's helped support people who are ministering in Mexico City or other places around the world. And so we help to support what's happening in other places. So that is still in place. And there's the whole self-supporting where people who are Paul, he made tents, it's called tent making, And that is still in place now. In fact, some of you probably grew up in a culture where pastors weren't paid. They were just had a job, or they farmed like anyone else, but they just were the pastor. And I wonder if with our changing culture, with fewer and fewer people who actually have a faith background, whether we might be returning to some of that. I know that there's something in the Alliance called New Ventures, and there are people who are going out and planting churches in various places. And sometimes it's sort of a both and. Some of them there are more self-supporting, or they are supporting themselves at least partially. So there's those examples of what happens, and they're all valid. They all have biblical precedent and biblical support. But what Paul was doing at that time was probably pretty unique. And he puts a little bit of a personal twist on it. Paul teaches freedom in the cultural matter of food source, but responsibility for our relational wake and the choices we make. And in that, he says, there are times we should set aside our rights for the benefit of others. In this part of the chapter, he adds a very personal twist. He says to them, well, after all, how did you people come to believe in Jesus? Well, they came to believe in Jesus because Paul set aside his rights to collect a salary so that he could spend his time as an evangelism and church planter. He was apostle to the Gentiles. Most places he didn't spend a lot of time. Corinth and Ephesus were the two outliers in that. In Corinth, he was there 18 months, in Ephesus about 3 years. But the most of the time, he would be there for a few months, long enough for some people to come to faith in Christ, and then he would move on to the next place. He gave up the freedom of a settled life. He did so because he wasn't relying on a salary from his audience, and that removed any financial hang-ups people might have about what he was doing, about what he was teaching. Now, it's hard to wrap our mind around how drastically Paul's life changed. His life changed when he came to faith in Jesus, and he became what was known as apostle to the Gentiles. He grew up fully steeped in Jewish laws and in Jewish tradition, and now he spent most of his time with people who didn't follow any of those laws or any of those traditions. About a year ago, I listened to a speaker from Jerusalem University College, and he was talking about Paul's travels. He'd done extensive study on the travels of Paul, particularly all the travels that Paul took by boat. In fact, one of the things that he does is he retraces some of those journeys. He actually does study tours, and you go on a boat and you trace all those journeys of the Apostle Paul, and it would be just fascinating to go on a tour like that. But he talked about how travel in those days by ship was really quite difficult, very crowded, and he made the point that it would be virtually impossible for someone to follow all of the Jewish laws, the kosher dietary laws, the purity laws when traveling by ship. You didn't have kosher food, you didn't have the water for ritual washing, and you spent time in close quarters with some pretty rough characters. The laws wouldn't even allow you to enter into their homes, let alone share a meal with those people. But he spent days, weeks, sometimes even months, eating with them, talking with them. That was quite a shift for someone who had grown up in the culture of all of those laws and tradition of being a Pharisee. Now, when you spend time with a person, and when you start talking with them quite a bit, something happens. You start to understand their unique cultural perspective. Now, linguistic barriers are one thing, but even when people speak the same language, they can have a far different understanding, a far different perspective. Culture is more than just food. It includes memories. It includes values. It includes perspective about what is right and what is wrong in the world. And Paul realized that if you want people to listen to you, you need to listen to them and learn how to speak in the language they understand. That goes far beyond words. It includes participating in that culture to the fullest degree you can without compromising any of your own values. So Paul didn't come as a religious professional. He came alongside people. He understood their heart. And as he did so, he earned the trust to tell them about God, about God's heart, and about the hope that there was in Jesus. Sure, he had the freedom to be paid. That was how it worked, not only in churches, but in all the temples that were so prevalent in that time. But he laid that aside so that he could be more effective in coming alongside people in their own culture. He could fit in with law-keeping Jews, but he could also fit in with people who knew nothing about the law. And that section, that key verse that Trish read earlier, in verses 22 and 23, to the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share its blessings. So this isn't just sort of a meaningless sidebar. It's really important in how Paul thinks about ministry. And he goes on to say, for the sake of the gospel, and you see that last little phrase, so that I may share in its blessings. Paul had a motive in mind, a personal motive perhaps in a way. He says in verse 24 through 27, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body, and I make it slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Paul would have been right within cultural boundaries and even biblical guidelines had he chosen to receive a salary as an evangelist. But it wasn't about his salary. It was about a greater prize. I think a principle that we can draw from this is simply this. We have freedom in our faith. Are we using that freedom simply to ensure our own comfort? Or are we using it to expand the kingdom? We have wonderful freedoms in our world today, in our country today. Are we using that freedom just so simply we can have just a little nicer life? Or are we using that freedom in order to make a difference eternally for the kingdom? Are we settling for fleeting comfort or reaching further by investing in the blessings of an everlasting kingdom? How do we do that? How do we do that in some very practical ways? Well, we can do it a little bit in just the way that we handle our money. If we give a percentage of it away consistently to kingdom purposes, that's a way to sort of change our heart. How do we manage our time? One of the biggest challenges for churches today is volunteers, because people's time is so scattered. It's scattered because of work, it's scattered because of play, it's scattered because of family, and there are valid things in all of that. All of it's more complicated. Work's more complicated because people work away a lot more. People don't have 9-to-5 jobs as often as they used to. It's complicated by play because there's more and more opportunity and sometimes even more financial margin for people to have more and varied things that just take them away further, whether that be traveling, whether that be hobbies. And families are further spread apart, and so people legitimately, they just want to be able to connect with family. And we've got the means and the transportation to do so, so we do. But do we, in all of that, say, I want to make a difference in the kingdom and have some non-negotiable things in our life that are going to be for the kingdom? For those of us that are sort of within a decade of retirement, or those that, for some, it might be a couple of decades off yet, for some are already in that, what's our view of retirement? Is it just sort of taking it easy, having more time to, time that we don't have to go to work and more time that we can play? Or is it an opportunity to say, now that I have some more margin, how do I use that to be able to expand the kingdom? Certainly we'll have more time to connect with family, and we should do that. Bless our family. But you need an identity that's beyond your family. And here's why. You need an identity beyond your family because your family may or may not connect in the way that you hope. And if they don't, and you don't have an identity beyond your family, you can become very resentful if that's the only focus of your life and things don't go exactly as you had hoped or planned. And the other dynamic is your hopes and dreams for how that's going to look like might not be those of your family as they go on and do their own things. And you can unintentionally place unrealistic expectations on your family. So you need another focus. You should relate to your family in the greatest way you can, but do so out of a perspective of invitation, not out of expectation. And that goes a long way. And along with that, have that kingdom focus. So how do we make sense of all of this? How does that relate to our culture now? Well, I want to talk about some trends in our culture, and some hard trends and some positive trends, and how do we sort of come alongside people in that way? What are some of the hard trends? Well, one is polarization. There are those angry and volatile arguments, people on either side of an issue, loud voices. But you know, people on either side of issues, they need people who will listen. People will hear their perspective. People who will value them as people, even if they may not agree with them. Do we know people well enough that even if we don't agree with them, we sort of can summarize their main ideas or how they've come to those, an understanding and how they've come to those ideas? What are the difficult points in their life? What are the pain points in life that have brought them to those ideas? In the midst of a polarized culture, we need to be peacemakers. Jesus is one who tore down the dividing wall of hostility between people. Are we helping to tear down that wall? Or are we scurrying to the edges and joining the voices of those who are yelling back and forth at one another? In our culture, we are called to be peacemakers. In our culture, there's another big trend, and it's something called individualism. It's this emphasis on my own rights, my own thing. And what's happening it's happening to the degree that there isn't as much understanding or much concern for what's happening within community, what's happening within groups. Now, Scripture affirms the value of an individual, and we need to come alongside and help people understand their identity, but an identity that goes beyond themselves. We are valuable because we're created in God's image. And throughout history, God has been working to try and bring people into relationship with himself, even when people continue to resist him or reject him. And so even in this age of individualism where people are shouting about fair and rights and I have to get my own way in this, can we come alongside and be in a way to encourage? We live in a culture where there's a huge distrust of authority. We need to come alongside people and simply be examples of integrity. As a church, we need to provide leaders with integrity. And another negative trend is what I call the whole alarmism. We live in a very alarmist kind of a culture. There's a growing climate of some impending catastrophe, whether that be economic, whether that be environment, whether that be political, whether that be health. There is this, oh no, everything is, it's going to completely shut down. How do we become all things to all people in such a confused and negative climate? We need to remind people that God is still on the throne. And yes, there are problems that we need to address and problems that we need to solve, but God is still the one who is at the helm. He is in control. And so we connect in culture. We make friends with people through common interests, whether that be sports or community events or organizations or schools or music. And the more we become involved with people and the things that they enjoy, the greater our opportunity will be to share with them the good news and the gospel of Jesus. Now, there are some pretty tough things happening in our culture right now, but there are also some good things. I want to point to just a few of those. One, there's just a greater awareness of social issues. There's awareness of human rights issues, things like human trafficking. Things like countries where people are just don't have those rights. Things even within country where there's some systemic things that have really been people have been disadvantaged because of the way that they have been treated. And there's growing awareness of those kinds of things. There's a growing awareness of the dynamic of economic inequality in the world. And more voices saying, maybe we should do something about that. Maybe we should look at it because it isn't a level playing field. Not everybody has the same opportunity and the same chance. So how do we make a difference in that? And it happens in various places, microfinancing in places. It helps just in being able to try and address systems so that these organizations and institutions that are so powerful can't just go their own way and do their own thing and tread on those who have no power. Need for environmental stewardship. There's a growing understanding that we just can't continue to just make a mess of our world. Live that lifestyle where we just make all sorts of garbage and plastic that gets into the sea and just not worry about it and the pollution in the air and what's that going to do? And there's a growing understanding that there is a problem that we need to find some way to address that. And as well, there is a growing critique of the culture of more. Because we look at it, and in the Western culture, it's the advertisers, they push you for more and more and more. I know in our holiday over the Christmas, we had some relatives visiting, and they were shopping for a new TV, and they got a new TV. So we started looking at ours and seeing it was 10, 15 years old and saying, well, maybe we need a new TV. Well, what kind of TV do we need? So I looked up the charts and said, well, according to how far we're sitting, how far away? Oh, we need an 80-inch TV according to that. We need something more. Well, I'm sure our TV that's 10 or 15 years old will do just fine. But there's that thing within us that I need more. I need the next one. I need more. Do we really need more? And there's a growing awareness of that. So within all of that dynamic, the things that are hard and the things that are good, we need to find ways to come alongside our culture. And that might be going beyond what we have done before. I think that this might be a time, it might be a season where there are some tremendous opportunities for the church. Not just because of the pandemic, because of the time that we are in. A few opportunities. Cultural realities. I missed a few. Technology, that's the world we live in. Is that a bad thing or a good thing? Yes, it is a bad thing and a good thing. And it's used in so many ways. You probably would not want to go back to a time before all the technology that you enjoy on a day-to-day basis now. We've become so used to it, it becomes like the air that we breathe. For many of us to go back to a time when we didn't have access to computers, to the internet, would be like going back to a time when we didn't have electricity and could turn on a switch. We've become so used to that. And that has provided some incredible opportunities. I'll mention some of those in a minute. And again, another one, the access to information. We've become very accustomed to that. That's part of the culture that we live in. And that, it has its dark sides, yes, but it is also some very good things. So provide some opportunities for the church. One interesting one is opportunities for the distribution of Scripture. A number of years ago, there was a church that had someone on staff who was trying to develop a Bible website. And they developed something, put some money into it as a church, but it really didn't go very far. So there was this person on the staff that he was doing this he had a part-time job at the staff, and it wasn't really going that well. But then someone had an idea. I don't know if it was his or someone else, and they said, the Apple Store, they're doing this thing of apps. Could we turn this into an app? Well, they turned it into an app called the YouVersion app. And that Bible now has over 500 million downloads worldwide. 500 million. And you go on their website and they have this little counter on the downloads. It's not quite 1 a second, about 40 to 45 downloads every minute. That's pretty incredible. I think if we do that right, by the time we're done this service, from the time we start, it's probably over 2,000 or 2,500 new people have got a Bible in their hand in one way. Isn't that incredible? That's pretty cool. As well, we have the whole dynamic of media. There's podcasts, there's messages that are up on YouTube in a way that has never happened before. Historically, the church has found a way to take the gospel and put it on the highways of technology and media. This part of the world, in Alberta, in Edmonton, the church in Edmonton, Buell Alliance Church, years ago, they got into radio. And they had radio broadcasts. In the province of Alberta, there was the Back to the Bible Hour, that many, many small communities had that as their teaching time. That was what happened. And it's interesting, in the Edmonton area, all these communities in Alberta, in and around Edmonton, so many of them have Alliance churches because Buell Alliance Church, many years ago, they got into radio. And they just had broadcasts. And people came to faith through that. There is incredible opportunity. There is also, I think, some new soil that is being prepared by this thing called the pandemic that we're in the midst of. When you read the headlines, there's all sorts of pessimistic forecasts. What's going to happen? But I look back historically. Well, there was a time from 1930 to 1945, 15 years, was a pretty tough time. The Great Depression all through the 1930s. Then, following that, World War II. And cities and countries were devastated. They were devastated economically. The infrastructure system in so many places was just devastated. And people started moving all over the place. And the next decades, probably at least 2, maybe 3 decades, was a time of unparalleled growth and development. Unparalleled growth and development both economically, but it also became an unparalleled time of growth and development for the gospel, as missions organizations just proliferated and took the gospel all around the world in different places and in new ways. Sure, there's lots of negative voices saying, what's going to happen? We will get through this pandemic. Who knows whether that's going to be this year where we'll be able to say, yeah, now it's done, or whether we've got more ahead of us. I don't know. But I do know that God is still on the throne. And I know that he calls us as believers to look for opportunities, because there are opportunities around us and there will be growing opportunities. I think that there is a growing appetite for hope. People are getting so tired of all of those negative voices. I've heard more and more people in recent months say, oh, I'm just not listening to news anymore because there's so much negative stuff in there. There's a vacuum. We have the opportunity to come alongside and say, hey, there's some truth, there's some good news. And I think there's also an appetite for connection. When we have the opportunity to be able to gather again without masks, without restrictions, when we can eat, when we can do all those things, I think there's going to be an incredible opportunity for connection. And that might foster some opportunities to do some ministries that might be completely different than we did before. We so easily get locked into, this is the way that we do, this is the kind of programs that we do, but maybe there'll be some opportunities that develop. Be thinking about that, because as we even get together at our annual meeting time, we want to talk about what are some ideas that we can use once we're able to get people together in stronger ways. Yes, we still have a community, we still have a culture where people are scattered with work, play, and family. And that was an issue even before the pandemic that limited how often people would gather on a Sunday. Well, now we've got media and we've got a way for that to work. Now we've got other opportunities for people to connect on through technology. Are there ways we can leverage that and help people get connected? So I think there is an incredible opportunity. Another interesting dynamic, I wonder, you've heard about how during the pandemic there's just an awful lot of people that are saying, it's time to retire. I'm done and I'm going to retire. And many have. And I'm wondering, is that a whole new crop of volunteers for things that are kingdom ministries? Isn't that an interesting way to look at it? Yes, we can do many things when we retire, but maybe there will be some people say, hey, my heart is for the kingdom. and I want to be able to invest my time, my resources in the kingdom. So a couple of questions. As we look at all this, and there's been a lot of information in it, questions to leave us with. Are we about our own comfort, or are we about God's kingdom? I think that's a big thing that we can take out of this. It's a question that I think this passage asks us to consider. Another question that I think it asks us to consider is this: do we view our culture as a threat or an opportunity? God's on the throne. Jesus will build his church. He's in the business of bringing people to himself, regardless of what's going on in the world, and he'll continue to do so. So we're going to be on board with what he's doing, or are we going to be confined to our own nice little agenda of comfort and convenience and an 80-inch TV or whatever else might be on our agenda or wish list for things that we want? God is still on the throne, and he's still building his church, and he gives you and I the opportunity to say, yeah, I've got the right to do this. Maybe I've got the money, maybe I've got the luxury, maybe I've got the time to do this, but I'm going to do something else because there's greater blessing. There's a lasting kingdom, and I want to be part of that.